Hi all, I am Priyanka Salunke from Voids India, an initiative that I co-founded with two of my friends, Naomi Mehta and Snehal Tripathi. Our platform is dedicated to curating discourse that explores the depths of thought emerging from the concept of place in the Indian context. We are grateful to have commenced our podcast series last year with Professor Dilip Dakuna, whose generosity since then allowed us to engage with him further on ground through talks and now even through a 3-day workshop that allowed us to go around Bangalore and explore the concept of place in ways that presented a plethora of alternate possibilities and opportunities. Today, we are privileged to continue this journey with Professor Dakuna. For those who may not know of him, Professor Dakuna is an architect and planner based in Philadelphia and Bangalore. Together with his partner, Professor Anuradha Mathur, he co-founded their practice Mathur Dakuna. Professor Dakuna also served as the adjunct professor at the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where he leads one of the core studios for the urban design program. Among his many accomplishments, he has co-authored several influential books, including Mississippi Floods, Designing a Shifting Landscape, Deccan Traverses, The Making of Bangalore's Terrain, and Soak, Mumbai in an Estuary. He is also the editor of Design in the Terrain of Water. In 2017, Professor Dakuna and Professor Mathur initiated the design platform Ocean of Wetness, which focuses on envisioning habitation in ubiquitous wetness rather than on a land-water surface. Today, after 3 days of explorations through our workshop, we expand this conversation to you all with the context of Bangalore and India, and also the world, to re-image and reimagine the concept of place. And with this, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Dakuna to the stage for his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Priyanka and Sandhya. I mean, we just had, I think as Priyanka said, we had this wonderful workshop on Bangalore. So I'm, up to my gills with Bangalore. So I won't be talking about Bangalore in this particular lecture. I'll be talking about a few other projects that we have dealt with, but also the larger ideas that we have developed. But I want to begin by saying something that I don't think needs saying for many of you, but much of the ideas, I mean, I should say all the ideas that you will be seeing today and the topics that we're dealing with were done with my partner, Anuradha Mathur, whom many of you know and perhaps have heard us speak in Bangalore, actually, a number of times over the last couple of decades, if not more, actually. But this is Anu in Rome. We were invited by the American Academy in Rome to be residents. And when we were there, we went on a number of sketching expeditions. And this is Anu in the Pantheon. In the Pantheon. And I only later discovered that she's drawing in front of Raphael's tomb. Raphael, of course, of the School of Athens fame. So anyway, she's very much a presence right through this presentation, and perhaps will always be. So I want to start with a statement of fact. We live in wetness. It is all around us. It is evaporating, it is precipitating, it is osmoting, it is soaking, it's seeping. I mean, it's in the air, it's in the soil, it's in the sea, and in plants, animals. And so we are participants in this wetness because we are wet ourselves. We exist as a consequence of it. So if you think that an astronaut, with this particular notion of the planet, never really leaves, is just encapsulated in a part of this planet, at a distance of 28,000 miles from where the blue marble was photographed, So what planet were they looking at? It's not a planet that we live in, but it's a planet that we are taught we live on. So we are taught that we live on a globe, which is really the planet enclosed with a surface that is 70% water and 30% land, or so we are told. But we know that it is actually 100% land, and water is in the service of land. In fact, this particular planet has enslaved water. We see it supplying and draining land. We are shaping, and it shapes and improves land. It provides land with energy and transport, and it increases. I mean, and this is one of the most popular things today, I guess. It increases real estate value with waterfronts. But this is land that is searching for release. So the question that we ask is, do we inhabit two planets? One, a wetness that we live in, and the other, a land that we live on. You know? So in one, wetness is everywhere. In the other, water is somewhere behind a line. You know, in one, we are hydrologic insiders. On the other, we are geographic outsiders. Our experience is immersive in one. In the other, it is extractive. Yeah. So what does this tell us, actually? This possibility that we are born into a planet and are educated into another. It could explain some of the confusion, some of the contradictions that we face in everyday life, and particularly in places like Bangalore and India, where, I mean, if you just think, I mean, people are aspiring to making the most sophisticated chips, but don't know how to lay a sidewalk. You know, we are aspiring to be a world economy, but don't know how to make habitable places. You know, so I mean, and we need our rain. We know we need rain, but we fear it's coming. You know, because of the disasters it brings. You know, so I mean, what is wrong in this picture? But it could also explain what Brian Fagan, an anthropologist, called the clash of cultures, you know, that came with colonialism, came with European colonialism. And here, I just want to take a small detour to show perhaps how meaningful it could be. For the last couple of years, I've been working with students in Colombia, in South America, for 2 years. And the first year, we were working in Bogota, which is up here in the Andes. So this is a section just drawn by Humboldt that is along the Magdalena River. So you have Bogota over here, and you have Cartagena on the Caribbean Sea. So we worked here for 1 year, and then we did actually this past spring work in Cartagena. But this is a country, together with the rest of South America, that was overtaken by the Spanish conquistadors and then the colonizers that came after them. And what they did was clashed with the indigenous population. I mean, killed large numbers, enslaved many of them, and then brought in new slaves from Africa. So this is the place that we then work in. But they also introduced the map. The map is a view, a very otherworldly view from infinitely above, looking down with parallel rays. So basically, it's God's eye that is as large as the territory that it is looking down upon. Now, which person can actually take this view? I mean, just ask yourself. I mean, this is a creation of looking down at an earth with a surface. Now, did the indigenous people actually see it this way? Before I get into actually the clash of cultures, I asked a student to provide me with maps of Colombia. So she came up with these two maps, among others, which I was very intrigued by, and I'm sure that you are perhaps intrigued by these as well. One is water, it's blue. The other is forests, it's green. And Colombia has the largest percentage of forest cover, you know, among countries actually in the world. It also has one of the highest biodiversities. So you look at this, and then you say, you know, you've got to ask this question: Have you ever been into a forest? Have you ever walked on squishy ground? Have you ever chewed on a gourd or on a fruit? You know, like say, I mean, even if you chew on a cucumber, it's my favorite example. It's 96% water. The sea is 96.5% water. But we don't call a cucumber a water body, you know, like the sea. Why is that? So this forest that is green should, I mean, if it is all water, should be blue. But these drawings, these particular drawings, I call nonsense drawings. You know, they are communicating something that could be perhaps thought about in more nefarious terms. I mean, there is a purpose to this that is more projective than it is representative. So if you had to unpack that by first opening up this possibility that this is a clash of imaginations, that on the one hand you have a colonizer who is on an Earth's surface that is viewing the Earth's surface between Europe and the Americas, is a geographic outsider, you know, and is there for extractive purposes. So their whole existence is extractive. They're naming objects so that they can extract objects. They're isolating things. Whereas if you look at the indigenous people who live in an ocean of wetness, and Bogota, particularly where we interacted with the Muiscas, you know, is at 8,000 feet. They're literally in the clouds, you know. So they are in wetness, but they see themselves living between clouds and aquifers. They are hydrologic insiders. Their existence is immersive. So this distinction could possibly explain even our condition over here, that are we living the same clash over here and continuing to be that way, that we actually think with two imaginations and we speak two languages at the same, not necessarily at the same time, but we move very smoothly between two worlds. So the question we ask is Earth a product of colonizing ocean? And how is this done? Because one is something that you're born into and then you're educated into. So it's obviously one that follows from the other. So how do you colonize an ocean of wetness? So, and I use this ocean actually very typically as, you know, from Oceanus. Oceanus to the early Greeks was this larger presence of wetness. It was not the ocean that we see as a geographic entity. But this is done with three design devices. One is the surface, the other is a line, and the third is the hydrologic cycle. I'll just take you through how I see each of these, you know, in the act of design. So the geographic surface, the geometric surface that becomes the geographic surface of the Earth, and that's why it's called geo. It is something without depth. It only has length and breadth, but no depth. That's what we learned from Euclid. This is one of the most ingenious design devices, and it works this way. So I'm in an ocean of wetness. I insert a surface in order to separate wetness above from wetness below. That wetness then unites waters above that fall to it and waters that rise to it from below. So this surface now, it's so ingenious, I can manipulate it to make this water go wherever I want it to go. And that is design. In other words, when I'm looking at an ocean of wetness, I know that the surface is incidentally. It has to be there by an act. And that act is this assertion of a surface, which every surveyor, their first act is to lay out and decide where the surface is before they survey. So what they're doing is they have to decide whether the anthill is on top of the surface or is the anthill part of the earth below it. Does the surface go into the marsh or does it hit the surface of the marsh? You know, so they're making these decisions and we then take that as the surface of the earth. So this surface then becomes part of the earth. So when I say that this is an earth's surface, everybody will understand. And if I say that there's water below the earth's surface, you will understand. But if I'm speaking to somebody who's not educated in geometry or geography and say there's something below the surface, it means that I can put my head underneath and look at the surface from the underside. It is an object that is laid out there. And that is why a map is more demonstrative than it is representative, because map comes from mappa in Latin, which means tablecloth. So this is what a surveyor does. He lays out a tablecloth before they draw literally on the tablecloth and then reduce it to scale in a map. Now, this element of the map has hardly been critiqued. We critique the representation of the map, but not its demonstration of laying the table. The second is the line, is the geometric line. And by geometric line, I'm talking about a very particular line. I'm talking about the Euclidean line that is only length but no breadth, or a breadthless length. So we draw lines, we gesture, we put trees together and we say that that's a row of trees and that's a line of trees, things like that. But that comes from a literacy that is grounded in this geometric line. So the geometric line that has no length or breadth is then deployed on the surface this way. So I have the surface now. The surface that I see now in plan, I separate a part that drains from a part that does the draining. So I have something called water in a water body and land that is now supposedly dry. Now you know that rain falls all over. Who decides where to draw this line that does the draining? Someone is dividing the surface between land and water, and we take it for granted. So we have water bodies now, water is contained. So we start with wetness, and we end up with water in bodies. The third design device, is the hydrologic cycle, which I consider actually to be one of the most ingenious inventions. So if you look at the hydrologic cycle, this is a complex hydrologic cycle by Robert Horton, one of the first in 1941. It's very complex and perhaps too complex for us. So we'll turn to children, and how we all learned to draw the hydrologic cycle, and we all do it in the 5th grade and 6th grade. So this is drawings actually by the Rishi Valley students from the 5th grade or 6th grade. I forget which one it is, but I just love this one, which shows the water cycle in the raindrop. In this fashion. But this is a drawing by Paul Klee and of the Bauhaus. And the way he depicts it in four moments is actually is how every child draws it. So you have precipitation, you have flow formation, evaporation, and cloud formation. Now what we have done is also something now that is fantastic. What we've done is, okay, you start with a wetness that is now all the time, not just everywhere, but it is also all the time. And with this, then you divide into four parts. The surface occupies one, actually, where flow formation happens. So what we have now is a reality, a resident water, in which reality is constituted. And what you have then in the other 3 moments is ephemerality. So resident waters are rivers, for example, lakes and seas. They become resident waters and everything else becomes a visitor. So we see rain coming and rain going, but the river remains there, even when there's no water in the river. So it's an interesting, sort of act of design that has its contradictions, and I'll play them out. But it is something that we all hold on to as if this is reality. But we have taken this particular moment and we have made the entire, created what I call a fair weather landscape. A fair weather landscape and a time of habitation now where we have reduced the ephemeral to weather events. So in this moment, we have trapped water in a line. So no surveyor goes out when it's raining. Though they ignore the evaporation, they ignore all these other aspects of water. They cannot see the separation of land and water when it's raining, right? So they wait for the rain to stop, then they go out, and then they draw. So they wait for that fair weather moment. The satellite waits for the clouds to pass. So the whole Earth's surface has been constituted by multiple moments of time. And that is what we see as the fair weather Earth surface. But what we have also done then is that we've constituted these visiting waters in weather events. So while on the one hand, we have trapped waters by space, on the other hand, we have trapped it by time. So we know the beginning and the end, and we can predict a weather event. And of course, we are failing now, as we speak, and becoming worse. So It is by design then that we have land, we have water bodies, and we have a time of habitation. And so that is the earth that we have constituted. And this earth then has become now what we design on and what we take to be the ground of design. We have also then designed the crisis. So if the earth surface is in trouble today and the line is in trouble from flood, is it by design? And why are we not challenging the surface and the line as design devices that are behind these disasters? So if I'm looking at rising seas, I'm looking at melting glaciers, I'm looking at atmospheric events that are becoming unpredictable, is this just water resisting its containment? And so if we had to approach it that way and see this as a problem, then we have to go a little further now and ask ourselves, can we see ourselves now as people with two imaginations, and that the earth exists in the ocean? So in some way, can we return to an ocean of wetness? So I suggest then that there are three ways that we, in our act of design, use. One is that we see precipitation two ways that it is received. On the one hand, precipitation falls to a surface and then drains off the land. Drainage is peculiarly associated with a surface, right? So we see it draining of the land. And we teach our children that. Rivers drain the land, and they have become drains. So over here, on this side, it does not fall to a surface. In fact, it just soaks its way down. It soaks, holds, exceeds, and then goes down and extends. That's how it proceeds. Saturates and exceeds. The second is that there are two modes of habitation. One is that we see ourselves in plan, this way, that we contain water in water bodies and we live on a surface of land adjoining water. So this line is an act of separation between water and land. On the other hand, we live on a gradient between high grounds and low grounds, and in a larger section between clouds and aquifers. So I'm looking at no surface. I'm just looking at living between clouds and aquifers. So can we do this? And you'll find actually that most indigenous people lived this way, between clouds and aquifers. The third is that there are two types of habitation. One is a habitation that works with a fair weather landscape and a fair weather time that is organized by the hydrologic cycle in this manner. So you have the weather events and the time of habitation that are both controllable. And this is the model and paradigm that is failing today in the face of climate change. And on the other hand, you have a time that moves with the cycle. So rain replenishes wetness that is already everywhere. And that wetness then is a perennial system that we extend until the next rains come. So we are working with the time of rain, if you will, but we're always in rain. So I'm going to take you through three explorations that we have undertaken. The first is the distinction that we make between Bombay and Mumbai. So Bombay is an island on the west coast of India, and I'm seeing it here as a settlement on the Earth's surface. Mumbai is a place in the monsoon. It's open to the monsoon, and that's what you're seeing over here. We're moving from plan to section. We're moving from Earth's surface to clouds to aquifers. So Bombay is an island city. I mean, that's how the British described it when they occupied it from 1665. And it's an island where land obviously separated from water, and you see it over here. You get a clear sense of how water is marginalized because water has never anything to say. It's always a blank in maps, whereas land, speaks a lot, says a lot. On the other hand, Mumbai is an estuary. An estuary is a meeting of rain and tide. So we are not looking at an estuary as the mouth of a river, because I tell students that rain, sometimes like the monsoon, does not have time to find rivers. it just goes. It moves to the, it moves to the sea, if you will, but the sea is never an other. So it's actually interacting with rain and tide. It's between rain and tide. So on the one hand, you have this island city that is a space on the Earth's surface and a geographic entity, and you can see how it has sort of just taken up all the water and the wetlands and all the stuff that is adjoining until it has become this monstrosity now that is sort of sitting there, against the sea, and now it's fighting the sea. Yeah. And on this side, you see Mumbai as an estuary, as a time in ocean. So we're paying attention to section. I mean, an estuary is much more about this presence of the sea. I distinguish between an estuary and a delta, as delta is a land-dominated system, and estuary is a sea-dominated system. So this is more a hydrologic event. That is a geographic entity. So on the one hand, you have Bombay that is an island, then planners design as islands within islands, and you want to control people by putting them in islands, just like you want to control the island itself. So land use thinking and land use planning is what is driving this understanding of place, whereas people have never lived within these contained entities. They've always been free to sort of move. The British tore their hair out actually trying to keep these people within islands. They don't live by space and time. They live by practices. And so we try to uncover what the sense of practice is as a language of design. So when the floods of 2005 happened, we turned our attention to Bombay. It was after the Bangalore exhibition in 2004, and then the book came out in 2006. So in 2006, we were in Bombay with no intention of working on Bombay. And then someone sowed the seed over there telling us about, why don't you do something about this? And so we just said, why not we take this as a challenge? And so Bombay then, became part of our investigations. And we produced Soak actually in 2009. It was an exhibition and a book. But it is really this. It's a new visualizing of Mumbai's terrain. It explores Mumbai in an estuary in the monsoon. That's the way in which we would describe it. So Soak is about making peace with the sea, about designing with the monsoon in an estuary. And we never really paid attention to climate change and things like that in those days, even though this book now is being looked at actually much more for its climate change arguments. So over here, you see the government is approaching it very much as an element on the Earth's surface. The first thing they blame is drains. For them, flood is a drainage problem. So let's get the water out as fast as possible. So we were doing something that is completely, against, all their mindset. We said no. Flood is a holding problem. We need to soak. We don't need to drain. And so this was something that was so difficult to communicate. And when they asked us to contribute to the master plan of Bombay, we said no. You come onto our terms. We won't come on your terms. So we were asking them basically to come onto the terms of the Ocean of Wetness rather than us coming on terms of the Earth's surface, because we know that the ocean of surface is a much more encompassing sphere of imagination. So we decided to approach it actually not as a master plan, but as a number of projects that were initiations rather than plans. So this was in keeping more with the nature of time and with practices of people, that as designers from the outside, how do we actually initiate change rather than plan, and master plan change. So I'll just take you through these three very quickly. 3 projects out of the 10 that we did. And these were what we call photo walks. And if I had to describe them now, I would say we were walking between clouds and aquifers. How do you engage a ground or a place between clouds and aquifers? And so it's not about a continuous walk. It was about the making. It was a non-contiguous, let's say, a non-contiguous walk that accumulated places in this sectional understanding. And you get design agents over here that you would not find otherwise. The flamingo became a design agent. These people who were living in Mahim Fort over here, there were 2,000 people over there. They became design agents for us, And so this is Mahim Fort, this is Worli Fort, and this is Suri Fort on the, that is, of course, I don't know what the state is now, but this was 15 years ago. And then we sectioned it. And this is something that was a big shift for us. I said, this is not a plan imagination, this is a section imagination that we require in an ocean. Because just think about it, when somebody is coming from the sea to land, they're plumbing the depths. Whereas someone who's coming from the land to sea is space conscious. So time is very much, and depth are conditions of the sea, whereas, the land is much more driven by space and distance, surface. Yeah. So we sectioned it and singled out our agents of design, and then we also worked in time and drew out practices. So these were notational systems that captured activities and practices of people, but also of birds, of plants, of life cycles that are all part of place that we tend to ignore in urban design projects on an Earth surface. We design for humans, and then we allow for let's say, animals and plants to sort of coexist, if you will, or to exist within or on our terms. But over here, they become intrinsic agents of design. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but in terms of, because I want to show you some other projects. But these were the nature of the interventions. They were small, they were markets, they were boardwalks, they were just very, very subtle changes. Designing a barge that was a temporal toilet and changing to a garden and that sort of thing. The second exploration that I want to take you through is Ganges and Ganga. Now, Ganges is a river, Ganga is rain, and the two are not translatable. I know that we learn them as synonymous, that Ganga is the local version of Ganges, and Ganges is the sort of foreign bastardization of Ganga. But for us, they were just two different worlds. They're two different worlds. But here, this project started with the Mississippi. And the Mississippi project was something that we did in the 1990s, and it culminated in this book, Mississippi Floods, that was published in 2001. So it was really the first book, and it was really started by Anu, and conceived by her, and I was just a PhD student at the time, and then I just got roped in, first as a draftsman and a driver and pulling the squeegee kind of thing, and then got just sucked into this, and I've lived in this world actually all along. But that was, she initiated this project in 1993. But we looked at the Mississippi, as a line that was drawn by European settlers, drawn by, Hernando Soto, I think, was the first Spanish conquistador to arrive at this what he called the Rio Grande, and drew two lines that said that this is now a river. So that those two lines have become levees 50 feet high, and they're growing. It takes a lot to hold a river to a line, or let's say to hold a river to a space between two lines. It takes this kind of engineering enterprise. These concrete revetments are continuously rumpled and changed, and then you have these old river control structures and new auxiliary control structures that are dividing rivers, sending waters down particular courses in order to solve the flood problem. But this is an engineering thing that just cannot last. It cannot last, and I think the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers knows it. So the way we represent is the way we design. That was the kind of thesis of this whole project. So we traveled the Mississippi landscape, We produced screen prints of various layered complexities that were not evident on the surface. So this, and then we, this I just put in because just to show us slaving at it, and printing. These are pictures actually that were documented by Professor Anne Spern, who teaches now at MIT. She came one day and just decided to photograph what we were doing. But clearly, who's more dispensable one over here. We're working with some real toxic stuff. But this is one thing that stuck out, which we noted at the time, but we did not really play up. And that is that there are these Native American mounds. This is the Mississippi Delta that is between Memphis and Vicksburg. And these are the Native American mounds, the American Indian mounds that are the other high ground besides the levee system. So when you experience something like this, as they did in 1927, there are only two high grounds that stand out. One is the levee that says, okay, that's the river over there, and this is land. Once upon a time, it was land. Now both rivers, and it's something that is happening every year. I mean, almost every year since. Whereas over here, the Native American mound is a discrete element that is not necessarily in the same Mississippi. So there are, in fact, two Mississippi. One is the Mississippi that flows and floods. The other is the Mississippi that rises and falls. So this is a Mississippi that I would consider a wetness in an ocean of, rain in an ocean of wetness. So two Mississippis rather than two resolutions of flood. That is something, that's an idea that sort of evolved. So here you're breaking a line to this thing. Here you're conscious of the horizon. You're conscious of this. You're conscious of depth between clouds and aquifers. So very different Mississippis. We didn't, like I say, play that up, but this is more in retrospect that I see it this way. But this is not something that is unique to the Mississippi. You see it in the Niles also, in our archival work that we have done. We sort of see this as the way in which almost all people lived. And when Alexander comes to India, one of his men, Nearchus, a general, who then leaves behind a memoir, talks about the Indus as very much like the Nile. And so the Nile, which was visited by the Greeks, led by Thales, Anaximander, and then Herodotus, who's the father of history, and I'm talking now about 4th century BC. When they come down over here, one of the first questions that Herodotus, for example, asks is, which is the Nile? Is it the Nile between October and May, when it flows between two banks? Or is it the Nile between June and September, between two deserts, the Arabian and the Libyan desert? And he, of course, decided that that's the Nile, and this is flood. Because he didn't call it flood. He described then the native Egyptian as living on islands in the Aegean Sea. That's how he describes life in this particular wet ground. But so these people, did they even see the Nile? They asked them. I mean, Herodotus asked them. I mean, where is the source of this Nile? Where is the source of this river? And why does it flood? And he says he gets no answer. It doesn't occur to him that for these people, they never saw flood. That flood is water crossing a line that they've never drawn. So they never saw flood, but that never occurred to Herodotus. They saw it like this. They saw water under the surface coming up. I mean, under the ground on which they stood, not the surface, but the earth. It just came up from the earth that way. So they were I would like to think that this was clouds and aquifers that they were inhabiting in this particular depiction. So they had two modes of habitation, as I've already explained here. One is this, which is what the Greeks wanted to see. So the Greeks had this impression. So Herodotus wanted this: define a river so that you have land now that is free, and so it is then flooded, intentionally. Whereas over here, you have people living on a gradient, which is how the Egyptians lived. So like I said, this is not in every part of the world. This is how people live, not just on in so-called deltas and estuaries. They also lived in high grounds in Bogota. We found that the Muiscas lived in the same manner in what they called a savanna. So this is a book that I wrote, actually, that came out in 2019, that was based on some of these observations. But it really is about the literacy, the cultivated literacy of a river, with these three understandings of course, source, and flood that constitute a river. Course is the flow of a line, source is a point at the start of a line, and flood is the erasure of a line. It is a literacy by which we have approached the Earth surface, literally as a paper that we have drawn on. And that is to some extent what geography is. Geography is the writing of the Earth. So this is the language. The language of the river parallels the language of the line. So source is the start of a line, course is the flow of a line, and flood is the erasure of a line. The three questions that came to mind, and that always, that still remain quite unanswered, is wetness is everywhere. Why do we see water somewhere? That of course is a question now that has driven this whole presentation. The second is this, where you see precipitation falls everywhere. Why do we see rivers starting in a point at the beginning of a line? You see, if I'm containing water with two lines, I then have to start drawing the line somewhere, and that line has to be a point at the source. And so we have been searching for sources for God knows how long, the source of the Nile, the source of the Ganges, which we have named now Gangotri. But the Nile, in 2006, they were still looking for the Nile. There was a whole National Geographic expedition that found the new source of the Nile, or what they call the longest source of the Nile. It's a real childish, sort of enterprise that I don't know how much money is spent on this nonsense. But on the third, this thing is flood is water crossing a line. So why do we think of flood as natural? We all learned that the Nile floods, and that the floods led to civilization and so on and so forth. But just think now about how ecologists and scientists have worked with flood. Rather than seeing flood as water crossing a line that they have drawn, they have created something like a flood ecosystem. They've created something like a flood plain. They've created something like a flood pulse. These are all now scientific concepts that are sort of guarded and the basis of facts. They are contexts that define facts. So I'm understanding my species in a floodplain as actually working with flood. So flood has become a necessity, and floodplain has become a necessity. And on that basis, we have marginalized nomads who have also occupied this. Rain has come, people have come, sheep have come. So many things come and go. Not recognizing that this is a riverbed. So now they've given that, and so Sabarmati is a classic example, of a space that has been given to a river. So I'm not going to go into the first parts of the book. Actually deals with the ideas and this thing that are much more universal. I'll just focus on the part of how these ideas came to India and what they did to the Ganga. So Alexander the Great, that we learn about in school, was armed, we think, with an army, and that's how we learn it. No, he was armed with this. He was armed with a surface, line, and cycle, and the hydrologic cycle. This man was a student of Aristotle, so he knew what he was doing, and he came actually leading a scientific expedition. And it's interesting, he was not the first, and he was certainly not the last. Someone like Napoleon did the same thing. He searched for the source of the Nile. He sent a scientific expedition up there. Caesar sent an expedition up to find the source of the Nile. Alexander sent 2 expeditions up to search for the source of the Nile. But when he comes to India, armed with the surface, line, and cycle, he comes in the rain shadow. He comes in the rain shadow of between the Himalayas, the hills of Oman, and the highlands of Ethiopia and the Caucasus Mountains, and he enters India here, and this is probably what he comes, what he marches into, he marches into the monsoon, and how do you draw a line in the monsoon? How do you create land and water in the monsoon? He thought he was at the source of the Nile. He writes to his mother saying that that he's at the source of the Nile, and then of course They say that he corrected himself, but I'm not quite sure, how, that is whether that is true or not. But I like the thought that he wrote to his mother, of all people, to say that he was in trouble. So he lasted precisely 2 years, and then returned, and they say that, soldiers were homesick and stuff like that. I mean, but how do you live with scorpions and, mosquitoes and God knows what all that you have to live with besides elephants and, that come out of this wetness, that are this wetness, so it's more serious and it's more, otherworldly than we have been taught in school. So I would like to think that the retreat was from an ocean of rain that they just couldn't handle. But then 2,000 years since, we see that from Ptolemy's map out here to the time we have now, we have contained water. We have created land and we have created water. And now we have an India of land and water that is controlled. So to focus just on one of the so-called rivers, the river Ganges, which is the colonization of Ganga as wetness that replenishes a wetness that is already everywhere. You have the Ganges now as a river that drains the land. So we looked at it. I mean, the three chapters look at it actually as the drawing, how the Ganges was drawn in the Bengal Delta, which we then call the Bengal estuary, and then how it was drawn in the plains and how it was drawn in the mountains. I mean, these are all fantastic, let's say, scientific enterprises that are quite remarkable. But if you ask yourself, how do you draw a line in a mangrove forest, in this marshy ground? But that's what they've done. I mean, from this squishy stuff, they have created something where there are islands now, and there are water bodies. So what we have done with all this, if I'm cutting it short here, is that we have created a river that is the spine of civilization, but also the drain of civilization, one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the world. That's what has been singled out. It's been singled out as such. We've created an object that we can train. This is the British training the Ganges to go where they want it to go. See, and then damming the Teri Dam that dams the Ganges, is the Bhagirathi. This thing is something. I mean, it's one of the most absurd projects actually, just given the amount of sedimentation that comes down from the Himalayas, which I'll show you images of. But this particular, I mean, if you just think of how a dam is made, if I don't have two lines on the two sides, I cannot dam a river. I cannot dam water. So they don't dam the Amazon. They channel the Amazon in a this thing and then dam the channel. That's what they do because they can't define the edges of the Amazon. So it would have been the same with the Ganges, but then 2,000 years it has taken to create this now single object. We've also created an object now that we can give rights to, and that we can recognize as a being. Now this, they say, is the way the indigenous people, in New Zealand and in various other places. I think this is one of the greatest victories of colonialism, actually, where you have realized an object and now you're granting it rights. This thing, and so now you're protecting the river, you're protecting your own creation, beyond any of indigenous, sort of understandings of place. And this is the consequence. Once you draw two lines, to define an object, water is not going to remain contained. We were in this disaster, this Himalayan tsunami. Actually, we were rescued by the army. Anu, Tara, and myself were rescued by the army from this disaster. We saw firsthand, the hills coming down, buildings getting washed off, and of course, this we see on an everyday basis. So, having explored the line, we then turned to the surface, and then asked, and now the thesis is India a geographic surface that is colonizing an ocean of rain that we're calling Sindhu, from Indu, which means raindrop. So we all know India is colonized,
But what if it is the colonizer? And that colonizing continues today as we channel and contain our rivers and now even link them and do all kinds of things now with rivers. So here we explore many parts of India with these two imaginations, the imagination of India and the imagination of Sindhu. So we begin with Varanasi, and there are two Varanasis, and then we move to the Tar, and we come down to the south, and then we go down to Sundarbans and the Himalayas. I'll just show you a glimpse of a few, 3-4 places. So here we are in Varanasi. Then on Varanasi, on one hand, it's a city that is on the banks of the Ganges. On the other hand, it is a Janapad in Ganga, which means that it is a high ground. It's a foothold. It literally translates as foothold of the people, but it is a high ground. It's an alluvial mound in the Ganga. So think about it like that. Starting from these two positions, what are we then exploring? So we have now a riverfront that many people go to see, right? It's a city on a river, and it gathers tourists, particularly in the month of December, January, February, that time. And they probably see something like this. But then the monsoon comes. The monsoon comes in June, July, August, and then what happens? This is taken at 2 times of the year, one in December and one in August. Same place, standing in the same place. I don't know if anybody here has actually been during the monsoon to Benares. That's a rise of 50 to 60 feet. And then the cleaning begins. Across 60 feet of all Himalayan sediment that is gathered there. Everything is filled with this, and then this cleaning operation happens. You've got to clear the ground for the next tourist season. But this is one of the secrets of Varanasi, as far as I know. I mean, I don't think too many people know about this cleansing operation that actually happens. But then you might see a place that is more like this. So you see something of this sort. And then, at this point in time, you also realize that there's a whole other world to Varanasi that lies behind, that's on the mound, but that has also been killed. It's a world of tanks. It's a world of kalyanis. It's a world of a holding system of rain that operated by this holding, saturating, exceeding. But the British, led by Princep, found these too polluted and decided to just get rid of them, and so they drained all of them to the Ganges. And then, and so all the pollution now is to the river. So you have you have an experience that can go 2 ways. Depending on the time that you're there and depending on what you want to see. I mean, there's both the presence of ocean and there's a presence of earth. I'll take you now to the west to show you a couple of explorations over there. So we know the west. I mean, the Thar, we learn it as the desert. we learn it as a desert on the Earth's surface. That's how we see it, and it's a real problematic thing, especially for the Europeans. As you can see over here, it says ground little known to the Europeans. I mean, they did not dare go into this place. I mean, it made no sense of them. But desert comes from the word desertum, which means left waste. Now, if you were living in a desert, would you ever think of it actually as waste? I mean, they discovered then there are about 8 to 10 to 20 million people living over there. How do you actually work with them, after calling their place a waste? But we all now refer to this as a desert. And like I say, the word desert should be banned from the dictionary, But the tar that we explored was tar that was just full of life and wetnesses of all kinds. So this is what happens when you see something as waste. You then make it productive. And so you have now canals of water being brought from the rivers that, from the Indus system. And you have even rice paddy growing in the tar, you see? And you have these channels now, and it's raining rivers all over the country, actually, because people want riverfronts. And in order to have a riverfront, you've got to have a river. So they're creating rivers. So I'll show you one river called the Luni, which the British drew very tentatively with dashed lines that you can see over there, dashed line, that have now become firm, that we see now as a system, as a river system, So we have really gone much further than anyone in the past has, So the question we ask, is Luni a river, or, on the Earth's surface, or is it a wetness in an ocean of rain called tar? So we went down this so-called river. So it starts in Pushkar, and you see all kinds of things. You see the goats over there, you see the dyers over there, you see the flamingos over there. You have the salt, you have salt mines. You've got the Tilwara fair that happens on a daily basis, drawing people from all over India. Interestingly, until you reach the world of salt, on the between the Gujarat and the Rajasthan border. So you have this lively place that is now being made into a river now with riverfront projects now that are happening as we speak. So we're exploring it again, one on the earth and one in ocean. Two different imaginations, two different experiences. Then there is the Oran. The Oran is people want to see it as an oasis in the desert. And we say, no, it's not an oasis in the desert, it's a wetness. It's a very unique wetness in tar. So how do you engage this wetness? So it's a place where literally the clouds come down, as it were, and wetness increases in intensity. In the world of wetness, it's always relative. There are no absolutes, there are no divides, there are no separations. And this wonderful jal tree that is expressive of this particular place. So that's the how we documented it in PhotoWorks. And then in our archival research, we discovered, there's this whole life to the Oran that, just goes unnoticed. It works in some ways with the wetness that is year-round. You get all kinds of, you get birds. We focus much more on the birds over here. They come from Central Asia. They come from Persia. They come from Africa. It is a remarkable world if you explore it as an ocean of wetness. So again, we have this larger realm that we don't notice very much when we just call something an oasis that is starkly different from, literally separated by a line from dryness. So you have this wet and then you have dry. In the ocean of wetness, there's no such thing as dryness. So this is what is going to come out in this book called The Ocean of Rain, which has been in the works now for the last I would say 5 years at least. But now to sort of conclude, the purpose of this book is that we need an awareness. We need a transition, and we need an awareness, of an ocean of an ocean of wetness. This is something that we've got to realize, that we've been living on a designed Earth, a land-centric system that has marginalized water. So today, if the seas are rising, the glaciers are melting, the atmosphere is storming unpredictably, is it because we have been working with the wrong paradigm? So this is what I say. And this is, I sort of paraphrase. I paraphrase Einstein, and we say this: we cannot solve our problems with the same design imagination that went into creating them. We need an ocean of wetness. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
You were talking about the dam in the Ganges. I can't remember the name, but you were saying how destructive it was. Could you explain a bit?
Dam.
Yeah, could you explain a bit about that?
Oh, well. So the Tei Dam is actually on the Bhagirathi, one of the branches of the Ganges that goes to Gangotri, and they built this dam on it. Now, when we were there, actually, as we were driving past, we were at least about 3 or 4 miles from the dam itself, and we stopped for a tea. Actually, at this there was a kind of a chai wala, stall, a tea stall over there. We stopped there and asked them, and just said, how far below was this a few years ago? Because we could look down and we could see, actually, there was a lot of silt, there was, not silt, but let's say the ground was, say, I would think about like 200 feet below us. And what this guy said is that it was something like, something like 500 feet, 600 feet below. It was all silted up. And then we saw for ourselves, when we were there, this is when the Himalayas came down with the Himalayan tsunamis, we were there. And we saw hillsides fall. We were standing on an edge, actually, where, we were rescued by the army, I said, and we were then, sheltered in a army establishment. And so we were put up in the army mess. But the commander, was Colonel, I forget his name now, but he sort of was taking us around, when he sort of came to know what we were, doing. And he sort of asked us this question, like, why is this happening? So he's showing how that the Bhagirathi was coming down like this, that thing, and they made the army, this whole army station was on this bend of the Ganges, of the Bhagirathi, and this hill. And my daughter and me were standing over there, and we saw this hill come down like that. It did not fall into the thing; it just fell. And so all the trees then were like this on this. I'm talking about a mountain. I was telling my daughter, and she wrote it actually in one of her college essays. She said, "Well, my father telling me that night that that if that had fallen fallen down all the way, we would just be no more. We would not get up in the morning. Because we were right on this bend, we were in the way of the Bhagirathi. So it is this. The absurdity of building a dam with this kind of siltation. The Ganges, the Himalayas are young, and we saw, this was just one incident, and we saw buildings go down, we saw trees get washed off, where is all that going? It's all going and stopping somewhere. It's filling up this place. So I don't know how long that so-called dam is going to be, but it is one of the most, I would think, misguided projects that have ever been realized. Probably another few years, and it would go. It was the back there.
You mentioned how we kind of separate the idea of wetness and dryness or water.
A little louder.
You mentioned how we separate water and dry or wetness and dryness and stuff like that. Extending on that, how do you think we can actually think about blurring the human and nature binary itself. Because this is that separation, right? So how we can also see ourselves as part of the wetness.
I'm sorry, actually, I'm not following. My
You-
hearing as it is bad, but
You mentioned how there's a separation between wetness and dryness. So, building on that, how do you feel we can blur the nature, the binary between human and nature itself, that separation?
oh,
Because we are part of the wetness, I would assume, right?
this is something that I deal with as a distinction between the two paradigms. One is based on the act of separation. So the land-water divide is one of the first acts of separation that have been done. And an act of separation is a very interesting act. It is also an act of creation, because with separation, I am, and like I said, we're dealing with wetness. With separation, I create a land that is not water, and I create a water that is not land. So when we think of land and water, it's a classic binary that one is not the other. So there is an exclusive sense to it. Now that applies not just to land and water, it applies to the way in which we see objects. So when I'm talking about a tree, and I'm teaching a child how to draw a tree, I then, or even when I'm learning to speak, I say something like the bird's nest is in the tree, which means that I've separated the nest from the tree. So language actually follows from what I call the language of landscape. I mean, it's not what I call, maybe I clarify, to be the language of landscape. So landscape is something that we are questioning, I mean, I know Sandhya used the term landscape, and it is in the blurb, that thing, that I don't think I would use it. Landscape as a language is precisely the language of land and water. It's the language of the earth's surface. It's not the language of wetness. So in fact, this book is about the language of wetness as an alternative to the language of landscape. So it's this language of the other imagination. So it is a very large project, and one of the things that it sort of touches upon, and I failed to sort of mention this in the Bombay project. We actually looked not just at the future of Mumbai, we looked at the past, that we have to now reconstruct the past, not on an Earth's surface, but in an ocean of wetness. So we're not just working the future, we work with an extended now, if you will, that then questions the act of separation, not just with land and water, but with all the objects that we have created. And just think about this. I mean, this is something that I feel we just pass over, that children learn the act of separation very young. So we are taught that this is a tree, this is an apple, this is a rat, and that is and we are shown images of it, or we see things, but that act of separation that comes with it is one of the most violent acts. That if you just think of what it takes to create a tree, that thing. So when we translate languages also, paid to tree, or mara to tree, that is a liberty that we take that has reduced all languages to the act of separation and the language of landscape. So I don't look at the language, as a language that speaks to me, from the word to me, so interpretation, meaning, all that sort of thing that phenomenologists get caught up with. I'm looking at the other side of the text that relates to landscape. And that language of landscape is something that no one has really questioned. No one has really brought to the fore. And I feel that is something that we need to really focus our attention to. So I'm sort of glad you asked that question, and it's the more extended use of the act of separation that is problematic. And so, but it really points to this, which maybe hasn't really come up in this thing, but it's an act of creation. I mean, and that's what I say with that act of design. I mean, the whole earth has created the language has created landscape, as this fair weather surface that exists, and we are dealing with this language of objects here.
Yeah, a very layman question. Could you give an example of layman question? Could you give an example of with this imagination, how any of your projects, how things are re-looked at in practical terms? Like you said, some projects in Mumbai or any other. Like, what does it mean? How does this translate into?
I'm sorry?
How does this imagination translate into actually redesigning a project? Like, how do you relook at it and do it differently?
Yeah. I mean, Bombay was one example, but one of the things that we've been doing actually over the last 3 days, like I said, is doing this Bangalore workshop, which Priyanka organized, and it deals with precisely this. It singles out two Bangalores. Two Bangalores. One is a Bangalore that is in an ocean of wetness, and one is a Bangalore that is on an Earth's surface. And so the idea then, I mean, just the three things that I called out, that you inhabit gradients as opposed to a land-water divide. So think about Bangalore. Think about the way the Kerry is understood. I mean, it really is sort of, I find it sort of unfathomable when people count tanks. They say that Bangalore had like 250 tanks or 300 tanks or 500 tanks or 1,000 tanks or whatever it is. And those tanks are, what are they focusing on? They're focusing on the water body. They're focusing on the water body. And that isolated sense, of course, doesn't have to remain isolated. People understand it to be a system of flows between water holding systems. But that is an imagination that is on an Earth's surface. If you had to actually think with the imagination of wetness, you would see these, you would not focus on the tank, you would not focus on the Kerry as a water body, you would focus, I'm sorry, I would not focus on the Kerry as a water body. I would focus on the low ground. And the low ground is something that can be designed, in relationship to the high ground. So again, it's the gradient that matters. It's not this separation of a water body that then becomes like this wetland for birds, and then becomes this, this understanding of a recreational lake, So we spent a lot of time actually in our drive around Bangalore on the first day, distinguishing between lakes and Kerry. And the Kerry is not a water body, the Kerry is a low ground, and that low ground I can build bunds wherever. So there are all these, what you see as water bodies that have been made today, were all engineered by bunds. So just to take that as an example, what is it then to design Bangalore, between low grounds and high grounds, rather than, land and water, which is what they have done. And so they violated all the low grounds by building in them, not paying attention to the fact that this is part of the Kerry. This is the Kerry. So I find that environmentalists today, when they're arguing for perennial wetlands, I think that is one of the biggest mistakes they're making, because they're taking an ecology, a perennial ecology, and seeing these as perennial wetlands. They're not perennial wetlands. These are clay economies, they are agricultural economies, they can be used in so many different ways. So when I have a bund over here and I have a low ground that is reaching it, it gathers rain, but then there is cultivation that happens. So I can have one crop, and then as the rain recedes for ground below, I have the first crop here and a second crop there. So you see these as agricultural economies, you see them as clay economies, you see them as potentials for now, sewage treatment. So this is all a holding system. It's a holding, saturating, exceeding system. Wetness moves that way. Wetness doesn't move in flows. And that is why there is this whole urge in Bangalore, and I have actually witnessed a conversation on it, of making these now into rivers. They want to make the Arkavati into a river by destroying all the tanks there, make it into a continuous river. And there are many people I have met in the Arkavati who say that this is how it was. It flowed before. See, when? I mean, these tanks have been, are not part of a river system. They are now being connected to be a river system. You see, you've got to look at it like that. I mean, and so this imagination is this projective imagination that is realizing the Earth's surface. And that is what we have to fight. We have to fight actually this ongoing strategizing of a design project with this other imagination, you know. And so, I mean, I can build on that. I mean, you can think of you know, building very differently. I mean, habitation. Once you don't make that distinction. So when we were, you know, asked to advise folks on the Mississippi, on the lower Mississippi, at that time we advised them to design without the line. Here now we're saying design without the surface. You know, and so there is an imagination that comes to play, and I mean, it's something that most designers, and this is what I found so wonderful in the workshop, the kind of conversations that we have, the questions we are asking, the kind of contradictions that we're facing, really apply to Bangalore, you know, and that we need to, I mean, if we want to do something about this place, I think we have to change our imagination. I mean, I know I spoke about this, the rain imagination, and I don't know, I mean, it was on Zoom. I mean, I just don't like that format. But it is something that, I mean, all that I've said applies very much to this place. And, yeah.
Thank you, Dilip, for rearranging my brain, and literally so. There's just so much in it that needs to be sort of reviewed and re-looked at, even in terms of, as you said, looking back to look ahead. I just wondered, you know, your last statement of reframing Einstein's line. How would you, in that framing, define or image climate change?
You know, there are two ways to actually look at climate change. I mean, one is that we're seeing the consequences of climate change. The other is that we're seeing the causes of climate change. I mean, I know that, you know, I'm working with my colleagues in Colombia. I mean, we've worked in the Rift Valley in Africa, we've worked in Vietnam, we've worked in this thing, and everywhere we go, actually, we're looking at consequences of climate change, especially when we're looking at the, you know, at the poor and the way the poor live. And so we are always trying to resolve their problems in the face of climate change, as climate change is happening, you know. And I think that this is something that I've really begun to disagree with and say that that is not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at the cause of climate change. And if you then think about what the cause of climate change, I mean, these are people who are not causing climate change. You know, I mean, we talk about the Anthropocene. I mean, that is the most misguided term too that I find. I mean, it's not all humanity that should be blamed for this. You know, I mean, it is just these peculiar people who have chosen to live on an Earth's surface. I mean, most people live in an ocean of wetness. So they have never applied a surface. In fact, they have no surface to possess. So surface is something that has been created for possession, it has been created for colonization, it's been created for civilization, it's been created for civilization in its new form called development, you know. And so these are all agendas that are pushing the same paradigm, you know. So when I look at climate change, I ask this basic question. I mean, can we design without a surface, without a line? Can we operate on gradients? And you know, Tara, since you're so involved in politics, I just have to say this. I mean, well, in the sense that, I mean, I think everybody here should be involved in politics. I mean, you know, but it is something that you know, it weighs on my mind that when I'm thinking of, and since we're talking about the carrier system, and we brought this up actually in our conversations, yeah, when you're thinking of the carrier system, and you're working with gradients, climate change is one thing that we are dealing with. I mean, the cause of climate change is one thing. The other one is social injustice. Social injustice comes from the same source, actually. So when I'm looking at a carrier system as a system of low grounds, then I'm seeing that it's a beautiful, I mean, I don't want to use the word decentralization. There's an autonomy and dependency relationship that develops, because everybody is working with the rain that is you know, with their particular, you know, place, let's say, with their place, but they're also working then with relationships, with alliances with people who then release water to them if in case they need it and they don't get enough. And that autonomy dependency leads to an amazing, what do you call it? I hesitate to use words democratic, but it's that system of autonomy then that develops as opposed to the centralized river system. So even with climate change, working with a centralized river system, as they're trying to do with cleaning the Ganga, which is a project that will go nowhere. It's just it's draining money more than anything else. But if I had to then focus on climate change with this thing, I would change to holding systems and change to this autonomy, but that also empowers people. It empowers people. So it's understanding locality very differently. And so we are talking really about a system, a career system that operated in this amazing political environment, but also what I would consider a philosophical environment that is grounded in relative and local and particular relationships, material relationships, as opposed to these sort of centralized system. So you cannot solve the problem of climate change with this big master plan that is dealing with rivers. It has to be small. And I call this actually the multiplicity of the small. We've got to understand the raindrop as opposed to the river. And if you understand the raindrop and you're understanding agency in the small, then you're really dealing with multiplicity, plurality. You're dealing with complexities that you do not comprehend. But indigenous people lived with this complexity, and we have demeaned them and made them subservient to a system that is so reductive, of this complexity, So that's what I say. And so when I'm using the word colonialism and colonization, I'm going back to Alexander and Thales and the 6th century BC, when I believe this began, this particular understanding of the Earth's surface as something to calculate and devise possession and colonization, but also scientific ground. If I'm studying change, what do I do? I first have to assert something that is fixed. And surface is that fixed. Without land, I would not have even history, for example. Herodotus was able to be the father of history because he had a surface that brought a common ground between the Egyptians and the Persians and the Indians, and he put them all on the same surface. And that's what we're doing with that. So the centralized urge of the surface of the globe is now broken. And I think that is where climate change, addressing climate change begins. Actually, it begins with this dismantling of the centralized Earth that we are, So Earth may be good for science and space exploration, et cetera, but for habitation, we've got to consider an ocean of wetness, and the Earth is within it.
Sir?
Yes, thank you. And a kind of follow-on question, really, from some of those that have come. It's really around private property. Private property. The paradigm that you're proposing is enormously complicated in relation to a kind of other paradigm of property. And I'm interested in how you, as a designer, architect, negotiate that really deeply ingrained ideological opposition to what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question that we're often asked, actually, particularly in New Orleans. When New Orleans went under with Katrina, this is the first question that comes to mind. Property is a pursuit of happiness. It's in the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and it's now in everybody's mind. But that was the purpose of the surface. So when I look at Columbus actually arriving on the shores of the so-called Americas, he's not just landing over there, as he described it, that he's landing and that he's, that he's discovered a new land, and we all still believe that he's discovered. He introduced land. So it's not so much that the Native American didn't have the idea of property. They didn't have the concept of land to begin with. So to have, to have property, you need land. But then you ask the question, how did they live without it? How did they live without land, and how did they live without property? Can we be more generous in our dismantling of the idea of property? So that urge has never really been undertaken. I mean, I know that, when I studied, for example, the communal system in Goa, or the Gangkari system, of circulating ownerships, of community ownership, we're still talking about it as ownership. Ownership of what? I mean, if you read Columbus's letters to Ferdinand and Isabel, his king and queen, and the same with Captain Cook in the South Seas, from Australia, he's describing people who are so generous. He even says they don't have the concept of possession. Those are Columbus's words. They don't have. He said you have to see it to believe it. They don't have the concept of possession. Now, that way of living is something that is so foreign to us. I understand the challenge over there, but can we be generous and can we be more expansive in coming up with a paradigm that is inclusive of these people rather than bringing them onto the ground of property? So someone like Chief Seattle is recorded as saying in the 1850s, of how he says that the European settler came in and took our land. He said, but for us, land is not something to possess. He says, and he doesn't, then he moves away from land and he speaks of earth. He says, we belong to the earth. The earth cannot belong to us. But he was using the word earth as opposed to land. So I would understand today, if I had to look at the Comunidad system or if I had to look at the Gangkari system or the thing, I might actually begin to understand what would it be without ownership. It was a circulating system of a practice that did not have the concept of agriculture happening on a surface. And Gandhi makes this wonderful distinction always. I mean, he keeps talking about motherland and Mother Earth, and I've just started to sort of exploring it, but I just think that is it's a very profound distinction that he's making between Mother Earth and motherland. So land is possessible, earth is not. And so when the Native American today I should say any indigenous people actually across the world are at pains to try and explain their concept of land. They go into saying things like this, that we don't belong to the land belongs to us, land is inclusive of this. And he said, what are you talking about? You're talking about everything. You're not talking about what they say. They're caught up in this language of landscape. They're bound to this language of landscape, and that's the tragedy. We have to give them another language to speak, or we have to be generous enough to understand and listen to them with a whole other imagination and language. And that we've never been. I've never seen that kind of generosity, actually, of understanding how they might. But this is a question, actually, of practicality that we're always confronted with. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question, which is actually two questions of sorts, I suppose. You've been speaking a lot about floods and the crossing of the line by water, so to speak. But the other side of that, of course, is the problem of quote unquote drought. Drought. And 3 months ago, Bangalore was in the midst of a water crisis where there wasn't enough water for most people to go around. And suddenly there was this flurry of people talking about the old Kere and Bavi system and the old Raj Kalves and Posh Kalves and all these other things, advocating that they need to be brought back. And of course, people have built on Keres, and you've already spoken about how it's a conception of lowlands. But really, my question is that the reason why Bangalore has piped water supply from the Kaveri today is because in 1896 and 1897, there were massive droughts where many people died. And Chamraj Wadeyar and Diwan Sheshadri Iyer at the time brought in piped water supply as a form of mitigating the risks of drought, as a form of uncertainty mitigation, essentially. So today, it is the same system which isn't able to support the load of Bangalore's population and Bangalore's, again, so-called development. But at the same time, simply going back to a Kere-Bave system, even if it is in complete authenticity, wouldn't be enough as it is to support the load of Bangalore's population and urban growth and development? So it's a tough question, and it's a question we're all trying to answer, but what do you do? How do you think about it? And the second part of that, oh, okay, we don't have time.
Well, if I do, see, one of the things to remember, I mean, and I know that, this is again the urge to problem solve that is, I don't recommend going back to anything. Okay? I'm just talking about a new imagination that I might then look at Bangalore now in terms of low ground, high ground, relationships, that I might now think of cultivating my gutters that are now covered. I mean, it's one of the stupidest things that Bangalore has ever done is cover their drains. You don't do that in a monsoon. I mean, you open all the drains, and I tell you, Bangalore's flood problem will disappear. If you have to take care of all our gutters. Just uncover. That's all the solution you really need. Okay? When it comes to drought, I mean, this is precisely actually why, how the paradigm has operated. The paradigm of the Earth's surface has done two things. It has promoted the river and it has demeaned rain as unpredictable, maldistributed, all that sort of thing. So the British actually did this. The British, their whole objective, I mean, and this is colonizers actually all over the world did it. The hydraulic projects were the money-making projects. I mean, like, those hydraulic projects, the railway projects, I mean, these were things that were extractive projects. So when I showed you that drawing of the Magdalena in Colombia, that was designed to extract everything out to Europe. That is what the river did. So the river did everything to demean rain. So it was in their interest to tell you that rain was unpredictable, rain was that. So we have actually lost our faith in rain, And so now when it's becoming unpredictable, this, that, and the rest of it, I mean, it's not the cause of, it's not necessarily drought, I mean, it is just a lack of holding systems. If you just think of the way the Kerry is operated, and again, now I'm not talking about going back there, but just learning from actually the logic and the philosophy of it, that when you think of the Kerrys, when the rain, receded, then they turned to the wells that they had created. And these wells were not to draw water out. All these kerries actually, and I grew up with so many of these kerries, and all of them had, 20 to 30 foot, wells that were open wells that just drew water in rather than were there to draw water out. And so, yes, when the rain then receded and things like that, there was groundwater. But today, we have taken water that is from the Ice Age out, I mean, and nothing is replenishing any aquifers that are, especially our deep aquifers. They are gone, or let's say in the process of going, So I would think that, it's, if I had to deal with drought, I mean, this is the holding system. It is primarily both for drought, if you want to call it drought, these are all created problems by destroying a system, you see? And it has been done purposefully in order to promote rivers. So the Ganga, and I have not given you examples of this thing. I mean, I have seen excavations in Varanasi that go down 60 feet, on top of the, on high ground, go down 60 feet. That is the level of the low water mark. I asked an archaeologist, how did people live 2,000 years ago, and it's been carbon dated, 2,000 years ago at that level, if the water rose 60 feet above them? You know what she tells me? She tells me that they built embankments. Now, I said, would anybody in their right senses in a monsoon world build an embankment? They would drown behind it, as the people in New Orleans did. So they wouldn't be, I mean, it wouldn't occur to them to build embankments. So what was it then? Basically, the Ganga was this vast wetness of holding in a jungle, in the earth, in the mountains. I mean, they were all holding. And that is what, and so there was no river to speak of. It was just this profuse wetness. So it probably rose like, I mean, if you're talking about this field of wetness, it must have risen about like a foot, and that was it. And that is how people were. And then, of course, I asked her also, I said, why would they live there then and build an embankment if they could just go up on the mound? This hadn't occurred to her. So there is a kind of an absurdity in our colonial education that just prevents us from thinking common sense. So the kind of contradictions that I have seen that the ocean of wetness opens up, are just amazing. I mean, in fact, they're mind-boggling to think that we are educated into this paradigm and not see the fakeness of the whole thing, and how we are, how we structure what we demean, as being this other. Remember, we are creating an other. That's what this Earth service does. In the binary system, you're creating an other, and the other is meant to be put down. And that is what rain is. Rain is blamed for everything. I mean, it's really a tragedy, actually, to see rain and actually fear it's coming. This is one of the contradictions that I find to be the most perplexing thing today. So it's a solution for both drought and so-called flood. But it is not. It's just a low ground, high ground imagination, and we have to work with that. And it's about holding in various parts in various places.
Okay, I'm so sorry, but we don't have time for any more questions. A huge thanks to Professor Da Cunha for his presentation. Once again, thank you to Priyanka from Voids India for being our collaborator for this session. Thank you to all of you for being here.